Welcome to Pastors on Porn, and I want to start by asking the pastors this question. Are you a numbers guy? Now, I know a lot of pastors don't like to admit it, but we usually have a pretty good idea about what our giving was last week, or how many people showed up at our weekend services. And we probably even track those things because, we feel deep down, numbers are important. Numbers don't lie. My wife sometimes says that I use numbers and make up statistics. So that can be a problem, I think. So she especially doesn't like it when I make up numbers when I'm having an argument with her. She usually calls me out on it. So I try to be clear on my numbers and have something to back up my numbers. I think that's especially important in the area of recovery. Working with churches, working with pastors, working with people in churches who struggle with porn and trying to help them. One of the questions that people ask is, how big of a problem is this really? And I've heard numbers over the years, and I'm not sure what to believe. Sometimes the numbers seem to be wildly inflated. Other times they seem to understate what I feel like's going on. So I always been interested when people have tried to come up with an accurate picture or snapshot of what's going on in churches. Back in 2012, Covenant Eyes threw some stats around that people often used. But in 2016, I think it was Josh McDowell that worked with the Barna Research group, and they did a pretty detailed study of porn use in the church. That study was called The Porn Phenomenon. It was done in 2016. But that's like 9 years ago. 9 years ago is a long time in our rapidly changing world. For example, think about the role and how much social media has changed our online behavior in even the last 5 years. So I was excited when I heard that Barna, this time I think they're working with Pure Desire, together they have done a whole brand new up-to-date study on porn use, asking many of the same questions they asked 9 years ago. In fact, they expanded their study and asked about a number of new questions, which I think it will be helpful as we talk about this question and answer this question. How involved or how widespread is porn use in our churches? Now, I think Barna, if you're familiar with any of their books or writing or read any of their work around studies, they do have a pretty good name because they are careful in their methodology. For example, in their survey questions, they didn't know who was asking the questions or even why the questions were being asked. The survey was done anonymously, and you could opt out of any question. It was interesting, only 2 to 3% actually opted out of questions. So that actually seemed to say that people felt safe in answering these questions. The emphasis on this was not just quantitative, but was also qualitative. They did their very best to find a random sample across all ages, not teens, because that's runs into legal problems, but young adults and older, all ages, different parts of the country, different demographics. I think there was 2,600 plus people that were asked these questions. And the nice thing is it gives us, I think, a really accurate snapshot of the sexual lives of people in our churches, in particular their use of porn. But also it gives us the ability to look back at where we are compared to, say, 9 years ago. Here's another important point. The survey and past questionnaires or surveys simply allowed people to create their own definition of pornography. So you could say, you know what, if I view naked images, for example, in a way to stimulate sexual arousal, I don't consider that porn. Unless it's like hardcore video porn, well, that's porn, but anything else is not. Just leaving Jesus' definition aside for a second, this study did not allow people to simply create their own definitions. They were very clear in what the definition they were asking people to comment or respond around. And their definition of porn was any image, video, or written material that is intended to be explicit and arousing. So I think that's helpful to know as well. Now, I purchased a copy of the study. In the show notes, I'll leave a link for how you can purchase a copy if it interests you. But let's just start with a few basic findings up to date of where we're at. General population, church population. Question number 1, how many people are struggling with porn? Now, there was different options. You could answer daily, weekly, once or twice a month, less often, as an example. In the general population, 61% of the population are currently viewing porn in some ongoing way. That would essentially cover the first of those 3 categories. Now, what about practicing Christians? Okay, now, Vern, you might want to stop me there. What do you mean by Christians? Well, this is also an important definition because, many people can call themselves Christians. And after all, don't we live in a Christian country or some version of that? People were given or defined in this way. They were asked 2 questions. First of all, if your faith was described to you, you described your faith as very important to you, and you attended church on a regular basis. So, it's maybe not a perfect definition, but it is a pretty functional definition that would cover most people in terms of how important they say their faith is, and they're living it out by being a part of a faith community. And the number of people in our faith communities, practicing Christians that say they struggle, is across men and women, 54% say they are dealing with pornography to some extent. To break that into genders, 75% of Christian men, 3 out of every 4. I always considered, somewhere around 2 out of 3, 67. So essentially, 3/4 of the Christian men in your church are regularly or somewhat regularly viewing pornography. How do you feel about that as a pastor? Now, here's the next stat, which I think you'll find surprising. 40% of Christian women are viewing pornography. 2 out of every 5 women. This is not just a man's problem. Now, that makes a big difference on the age of women. For example, younger women, millennial women are 62%, and Gen Z women, 64%, are looking at and using pornography. Older women are a lot less, but overall, 40%, 2 out of every 5 women are involved with pornography. So pornography is a people problem. It's not just a male problem. And it's impacting all of us. You say, okay, impacting all of us. Well, how is it impacting us, you may say? One of the things I really liked about this new study is they actually dived into some of the reported effects that it was having on people's lives. For example, their personal sense of well-being. So they asked people questions like, how often do you experience thoughts of anxiety or depression or thoughts of self-criticalness or thoughts of self-harm? And then they correlated that to how often people viewed pornography. Across the board, the more pornography someone views, the more unhealthy they are in their mental health. Now, I know you could argue, Vern, a strong correlation does not prove causation, or you could argue which came first, the mental health challenges, then the porn, or the other way around. The clear answer is that there is a strong connection, and porn usage poses a clear and present danger to the mental health of the people that we say we so value in our churches. I see it every week in the guys I work with. I can tell sometimes in the first 15 seconds by looking at them. If they struggle with porn, if they relapsed, and they start sharing their feelings are discouragement, depression, self-loathing, shame. It's like an emotional punch in the gut, or, below that that on their bodies, it has a huge toll on their lives. And if we want to view with people's spiritual health, I mean, if you've read Peter Scazzaro, you know this. If you want to help people with their spiritual health, you have to help them with their mental and emotional health. And I would add to this, if you want to help people with their emotional and mental health, you need to help them with their sexual health. All of those are tied together. This is not an isolated issue. People's mental health is tied to their spiritual health, and both are tied to their sexual well-being. Okay? That's really important. Now, next question. Let's talk a little bit of what effect is this having on their relationships. Let's even talk about past tense, for example. Men and women were asked if there has been, past tense, porn usage in your marriage. Is this still something? Is there still healing that needs to happen? Is this still causing present tense problems? Women were far more likely, by a 3-to-1 ratio, that says this is still affecting our relationship. Men were far more likely to say, you know what, we're over this. This is no big deal. There was a complete disconnect with the experience that men and women had around the effects of porn. So you can see, for example, how damaging this would be for a well-meaning husband or pastor or church counselor to simply try to rush through or minimize the time and work that healing requires in a relationship from porn use. I heard, the fellow interviewed from Pure Desire made this statement, and it's well worth saying, and I'm not trying to get into the whole theological weeds about men in leadership versus women in leadership, but the fact that most of our boards and most of our church leadership is still made up almost exclusively of men, is it any surprise that we've tended to minimize the effects that porn and porn use has had on the people in our church and the marriages in our church? All right. So let's say someone says, okay, well, I am in church. I'm a Christian. I'm one of those practicing Christians, and I'm struggling with porn. Now what? Well, here's a depressing stat. Of the people in our churches who are using pornography, 40% in the general population say that nobody knows, but within our churches, we only do 1% better. 48% of people who are struggling with porn in our church say that nobody knows. Almost exactly half. Half of the people struggling in our church say that nobody knows that they're struggling. I'm sure you've read some of that, if you've read anything on church leadership systems, you've probably heard this statement: our system is perfectly designed for the results that we're getting. So if only half of our people feel comfortable talking about their sexual struggles, you could ask yourself, how have we designed our system? Have we designed, here's a couple options, but there might be many more. Have we designed our churches to believe, and in our messages, that the pornography use is so stigmatizing that it needs to be hidden at all costs? Maybe that's the system we designed. Or maybe we designed our system that it's no big deal, or that everybody struggles. One of the stats that was quite disturbing, I found, was they asked Christians how comfortable you are with your pornography use. And you were kind of given three options. I wish I didn't use it. I wished I used it less. Or I'm comfortable with my present level of use. Okay? Only among practicing Christians who view porn, only 21% said, I wish I didn't use pornography at all. In other words, 79% were comfortable or somewhat comfortable with their porn use. have we normalized it to that degree? Or have we simply somehow, given the impression if you struggle with porn, there's really no solution. It's not a big deal, or everybody's doing it. Whatever it is, we have not given a compelling view of God's plan for sexuality, or that healthy sexuality is possible. 79% of our people are saying, you know what, I've essentially given up. All right. Let's just say, for example, you struggle with porn use in your church, and you would love to ask for help. Well, first of all, only 16% of people who struggle say that they've actually reached out for help. 84% of people, when asked who is helping them in their struggles, said, no one. All right, well then let's talk about that 16%. Let's say if you were going to reach out for help, who would you talk to? You go to church, you're part of a faith community, who would you talk to? And they ranked a whole number of different help, sources that you could get. Where would a pastor be on that? Well, you think, I'm sure it would be number 1 or number 2. Well, it's actually not number 1. That's a counselor. Okay, well, we could explain that because we've really valued counselors in different settings, a therapist or people going to get therapy. Maybe number 2. Nope, it was a doctor. Pastor didn't show up until number 9. People were so hesitant to talk to pastors. It was the 9th on a list of who you would go and talk to about your struggle with pornography. Pastors are completely removed from the private sexual lives of people that they say they lead or are discipling. I mean, that's discouraging. Only 11% of people said they would be comfortable going to their pastor. Remember that statement? What have we designed our system towards? Obviously, people do not see pastors as a safe place or a helpful place or a knowledgeable place around their struggle with pornography. Well, let's ask the question at a bit of a larger level. Let's kind of take a bit of a macro sense and talk about churches as a whole. How many churches have recognized this as a problem and are trying to address it, trying to change this system and say, you know what, we have to provide programs or resource materials or way to help people who are struggling with porn? Back in 2016, only 7% of churches could say that they had specific help for people who are struggling in this area. 93% of churches did not. Today, we're only marginally better. 10% of churches. We've gone from 7% up to 10% of churches who say that they know how somebody could get help in their churches. Here was a really crazy stat when they asked pastors. When they asked lead pastors, does your church have a plan to help somebody struggling with porn? 37% said they didn't know. Kind of reminds me of the person on the stand who doesn't want to answer a question that says, I don't recall, to a question that they do recall, but they don't want to answer, right? Or maybe they're thinking, well, maybe we have counselors that people are talking to, or maybe we have a program about recovery. I don't know, maybe they're talking about it there. It just shows how uninvolved the leadership was with the real life needs and struggles of people in their church. It shows how marginalized people feel in their struggle, that they do not view their churches as a place for their, sexual brokenness and as a place where they can find help, hope, and healing. Let me just end on this one final question. Why are churches and pastors so disconnected? One of the questions that they asked, and obviously it's one of the things we've talked about in this podcast, is how many pastors acknowledge that this is a current struggle for them personally. Now, we're going to hopefully assume that pastors were honest here. Over 50% of pastors say that this has been a struggle in their life at some point. Now, that gives them a bit of an out. At some point, could be 2 weeks ago or it could be 20 years ago. But the question was pretty generous and pretty broad. 20% of pastors, or 1 in 5, said that they are currently and actively struggling with pornography. That is around basically 1 in 5. Back in 2016, it was 1 in 7. So it used to be 15%. Now it's 20%. So you can tell we're not going in the right direction here. You know, I do know, for example, that youth pastors have a higher percentage. Youth pastors are struggling with porn more than lead pastors. Well, over time, youth pastors become lead pastors. Now, I'm not saying that youth pastors are less holy than lead pastors, but you can see the way that this is going and the progression this is going. I think it does beg a question. If pastors are feeling or believing or struggling with the idea that the enemy has something on them, that the enemy has blackmail material spiritually on them, you can see how hard it would be for a pastor to lead into this area, and how this might be a part, not the only part, but a part on why we have such a deficit in helping people with the real life struggles they're going through in their lives and their marriages. As I said, the numbers don't lie. We'll see you next time.